Hey everyone, welcome to Impossible Trade-Offs. I am your host, Katie Harbath. I'm coming to you today from San Francisco, California. I'm in an Airbnb in the Mission District, which is where the company that I work for, Duco, has their offices. I'm out here for 2 weeks before I then go to Stagecoach with a friend, which is a country music festival. And I'm going to do a solo episode today. I had a plan to have a webinar where we were going to be talking about this trust and safety market research report that we did at Duco, but we had to reschedule that. And so I thought rather than just not doing a podcast, I thought I'd try to do a solo episode where I answer some of the questions that I get quite often from people in order to have something to point folks to, in which if they want to learn more about me and some of the different things that I do, my career, and how I've sort of gotten to this point in my life. So if you know me pretty well, you may be hearing repeats of stuff that you've already heard. Totally understand if it is not of interest for you to want to listen to this one. I'm also going to put in the show notes a bit more detailed timestamp and show notes for this one so that if you want to jump ahead to different topics, you can. But we're going to be covering 10 different topics today. We're going to be looking at my career story and background, who I am outside of work, though let's admit a lot of who I am is also tied to my work, what I do for my career and kind of what a typical day in the life looks like, how I mapped out my post-Facebook life. I'm going to talk about how, I get asked a lot about how they can get into a career in tech. So I want to cover that. I'm going to go into a little bit about what I read and how I stay on top of the news. I'm going to share a bit more about why I chose to tell my story and try to be a thought leader and talk about these issues a lot more. And as part of that, how I prepare my Substacks, how I think about producing content every single week, share some lessons from writing my Substack, and then also talking a little bit about what I'm thinking about what comes next. So I hope you enjoy and let me know if you like this format. All right, let's start a little bit with my bio and sort of who I am and where I've gotten to today. So I am from Green Bay, Wisconsin. I am the oldest of three kids, my mom and dad and my brother and his wife and my sister and her husband and her two boys are all back in Wisconsin. I'm the only one that escaped from there, but I grew up in Green Bay. I went to Bayport High School, which is just outside of the city. I am an owner of the Green Bay Packers, as a lot of people are. If you're not familiar, the Green Bay Packers is one of the only sports teams that is actually owned by the community. And all it really means is I gave $250 for a piece of paper, but it's pretty cool to be able to say that you're an owner of an NFL team. Anyways, I went to UW-Madison for school where I studied journalism and political science. I totally thought that I was going to be a print reporter, but I ended up, when I got into the journalism school and I was in the first cohort of Journalism 202, which was a new course that they had put together, I had my professor, Katie Culver, made me become the webmaster for our final project. And I was so mad. I was like, I'm going to be going into print. I'm not going to be doing any of this digital stuff. Katie has definitely had the last laugh on that one. But while I was there, I worked at the student newspaper, the Badger Herald, where I was there for about 3 years. And I met a lot of people who are dear friends today, including some that actually were involved in politics. And they were involved in Norm Coleman's Senate race in 2002. Now, for those of you who remember that time frame, this is the Minnesota Senate race where the incumbent Senator Paul Wellstone had died a couple of weeks before Election Day. And so I remember going out there for the conventions in the summer and then going out there to volunteer the last 2 weeks of the campaign. And I caught the bug. I caught the politics bug. And I remember my friend who was on that campaign telling me, he was like, you're going to enjoy political communications a lot more than going and covering school boards and other things like that. And when I didn't get the editor-in-chief job at the student newspaper, I ended up going and working for and interning for the state Republican committee. And so after graduation, a friend of mine, some of those friends had gone out to DC to work on Senator Coleman's office. And a friend and I, we were both looking for jobs in DC. And everyone said, if you wanted to get a job in DC, you just got to move out there. And so we, in July of 2003, went to dinner. Our favorite place was Old Chicago. And we decided that we were going to do it. And so a couple of weeks later, we hopped in our cars and we drove out to DC with my friend's mom. I've never been so terrified before in my life driving into Washington. I didn't have that much traffic in DC. Trying to navigate the spokes and wheel and grid system of DC. Remember, this is a time of no GPS. We don't have phones. We're like printing out MapQuest maps to try to find our way around. But anyways, we got to DC. I ended up finding a job at the Macy's perfume counter in Pentagon City for a couple of weeks while we were starting to, look around for jobs. The state party had given my resume to the national party. And so I talked to them and a few other folks. And in August of 2003, I joined the communications department of the Republican National Committee as a communications assistant. So I was answering phones. I was, just kind of helping whatever folks needed. But because I had started doing some digital stuff at UW, including getting the Badger Herald online, I had a Blogspot blog while I was, for 2 summers, I was a copy editor in the Wisconsin State Journal newsroom in the summer. And so at the time, I didn't realize it was like a precursor to Twitter, because I would take stories that came off the AP news feed and I would be putting them out on this blog, very Twitter-like, X-like today. And I wrote this memo to my boss about all this stuff that I thought that we should be doing online. And he was basically like, congratulations, it's all yours, because the people that were running the RNC website at the time were heading over to President Bush's reelect to run his website. So it was like, congratulations, all yours, but we really don't have that much money. This is early days. Facebook doesn't exist yet. YouTube doesn't. Twitter doesn't. Nothing like that. And so I actually started teaching myself how to do very basic HTML code, CSS styling, things, Flash, and things of those nature. And so I started hard coding some websites that we were doing. We had professionals do the actual GOP.com, but I did ones like, there's one we had called Flipper Cam, where we had these interns that had to dress like dolphins go around and follow John Kerry because he's a flip flopper. And they would have to FTP up video overnight to us for me to then cut that down. And we usually had to put it in 6 different formats. You had to do high bandwidth, low bandwidth, real time, quick time, and another player that I'm like, Windows Media was another one that we had to do. And so it was very early stage. We called it e-campaign. We did a lot of fun like web videos. We also did a lot of games. A lot of it was about getting kind of earned media and stuff like that. This was also the age where in 2004, where bloggers had uncovered the fact that CBS had used some doctored materials around a story around President Bush and his military service and stuff like that. And so bloggers really came on the scene too. So following the 2004 campaign, I ended up staying at the RNC for a bit longer. And then in October of 2005, decided to go to a committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, the Committee on House Administration, to be an assistant press secretary, because I wasn't sure if this digital thing was actually going to take hold and be something that could actually be a career. But while I was there, I continued to help people build websites, and I did a lot of web stuff there. I then ended up going on a House campaign for the 2006 cycle. And then after that candidate dropped out in 2006, this was Bob Ney during all the Jack Abramoff scandal stuff. I then decided to go and work at a public affairs firm called DCI Group for about 6 months. And then I went to the Rudy Giuliani campaign up in New York for a year. So I was up in New York from February 5th to the end of January in 2008. I was one of the first people on the campaign where I was helping to do we still called it e-campaign back then, but doing all the digital stuff. So now, we are doing a lot on, the mayor himself wasn't on many of the social media platforms, but we were doing a lot with YouTube, and MySpace was still a thing back then. Facebook, of course, and Twitter had just sort of had its breakout moment at South by Southwest. So not a ton on Twitter, but, still a lot on video and other social media type things, a lot with bloggers. I always have to remind people that this was when he was still known as America's mayor, so it's a very different Giuliani than today. But after he dropped out after Florida, I then moved back to DC, and I went back to work at DCI Group and did public affairs for about a year and a half, doing digital stuff, working for corporations who were putting together campaigns to try to help, boost whatever issues and policies that they were trying to get passed at either the federal or state level. I then went to go work at the National Republican Senatorial Committee as their chief digital officer. So this was, I think, around August of 2009. And so I was working with all the committee itself and all of our candidates who were running for Senate that year in which of how to use digital. Now, by this point in time, Facebook now had their person, Adam Connor, that had been hired. Google had dedicated people that were working with these campaigns and stuff. And so after the election cycle in 2010, Adam actually ended up approaching me about coming and working at Facebook, because he saw that President Obama would be running for re-election in 2012, and there would be a lot of Republican candidates running, and that given his Democratic background, it would be good to have somebody with a Republican digital background in which to work with those campaigns. And so in February of 2011, I joined Facebook's DC office. I was probably employee number 7 or 8. I someday need to get the exact number on that. And I then ended up spending 10 years at Facebook. Now, my job at the company changed a ton over that period of time. So that initial year and a half or so, the 2011 through the 2012 cycle, was very much focused on helping Republican candidates, elected officials up and down the ballot know how to use Facebook pages. We weren't selling ads there at the time. There wasn't a team for that at Facebook. There were some folks that were doing it for sure, but we didn't get a dedicated political sales team until after that. And so after 2012, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. I was a little tired of the US politics sort of hamster wheel, but I was talking to the RNC about potentially coming over and being their chief digital strategist. But I also really enjoyed the corporate world. I enjoyed the tech world, where I no longer felt like I was pulling people along to have to do tech, but I was really being pushed forward in terms of where technology was going. Now, remember, this is a period of time that is only a year or so after the Arab Spring. Everybody was celebrating how President Obama had used digital and data in which to win. And so we actually had a growing public policy team globally. And I was starting to get a lot of questions from my colleagues about that they were getting from other elected officials or candidates and parties around the world about how they could do what Obama did. And so I pitched to the company, and this was a 6-month process. It was not anything that happened overnight for sure, but about me starting to build out the team internationally that worked with politicians and governments. This is also the first time I realized how elections globally go in cycles. And 2014 was another big year of elections, not as big as this year, but was another big one, with India, Indonesia, Brazil, the US midterms all going to the polls, European Union. And so after about 6 months of me talking to a lot of people, talking to my bosses at Facebook, kind of figuring this out, they agreed to let me to start building out that international team. So I officially started doing that of May of 2013. I was somebody who had not traveled internationally before other than to Canada. And my first trips overseas were to Australia and India for their elections. And I started traveling the globe, working with these politicians and parties and doing trainings for anybody that was eligible to be on Facebook about how to use Facebook pages. I also started building our election day reminders globally. We didn't have an engineering team at the time. And so I was building all of those by myself. I had some engineers that had helped to build me some tools to make that easier. But I was kind of pulling all of that together. We were kind of a 3-person team. We then hired somebody in Latin America. We also started, there was a data team that had been hired. So we started doing a lot of looking at what people were talking about on the platforms regarding the election, what issues, what candidates, things of that nature. We were partnering with news organizations to do, the Facebook Live product didn't exist as it does today, but we partnered with companies like Ustream to actually do these interviews with news organizations and the candidates, and we would stream those online. And then when this 2016 election started coming around, we actually started planning for that in the fall of 2014. And the debate started in summer of 2015, and we partnered with Fox News for the very first Republican debate. We partnered with CNN on debates. We had a big presence at all of those. The teams within Facebook, we had a lot more resources in which to help us do things. The civic team, engineering engineering team got hired in summer of 2015. So we actually had others to help me build a lot of these things. And they started building tools to help people know who was on their ballot, or help to do voter registration and just take it to a whole new level. Now, a lot of this, if you've heard me talk about this before, a lot of you know that May 9th, 2016 is a big date, I think, in sort of the history of tech and elections, but also in my own career. This was the day of the Philippines election. I was at a news organization doing various media hits again about what people were talking about on the platform vis-a-vis the Philippines election. And I remember looking at my phone at my Facebook feed and seeing a story from Gizmodo where a contractor was claiming that somebody had suppressed, that they were told to suppress conservative content in a tool we had, a feature we had called Trending Topics. So I remember handing my phone to my colleague being like, I hope news can't travel across the Pacific this quickly. And did my last TV hit and then rushed to the hotel, rushed back to the States to then have to deal with that controversy. And the reason I say this is, those are both big deals, is Philippines really was, as Maria Ressa says, ground zero for a lot of the issues and stuff that we continue to see today. A month later, you had Brexit. Along with that Trending Topics controversy, you had, that sort of grumblings from conservatives about how liberal Silicon Valley was burst out into the open. With Brexit, you started to have some questions of like, what the heck is going on and how are they using Facebook ads or targeted ads in general? And then, of course, the November 2016 election sort of just changed everything. And so my job shifted from doing a lot of those things that I was doing to now a lot of the issues and stuff we talk about today. We were needing to figure out how we were going to do fact checking on the site, how to build political and issue ad transparency, how to think about foreign interference. There was a ton of, it didn't all happen right away, actually. The story coming out of November 2016 was really Macedonian teenagers using the platform in which to push fake news to just get clicks and make money. The Russian ad stuff came later in 2017. Summer of 2017 is when I knew that we were finding some of this. We're trying to figure out what was going on, and we announced it in September of that year. And so as part of that, we were building a lot of these tools because there were congressional hearings. I was hiring a lot more people on my team to do sort of the training with the politicians and governments. I was hiring people to help coordinate all the election stuff globally. We then had the Cambridge Analytica scandal happen in March of 2018. And so through the end of 2019 was a lot of, we did the first election war rooms, not only in the US and Brazil, but then also for elections in Indonesia, India, and the European Parliament in 2019. And then in the fall of 2019, there was a lot of discussion around political ads, targeted political ads. Twitter decided to stop doing political ads altogether. Mark did his big speech at Georgetown about freedom of expression and stuff like that. And it was at this period of time I got switched teams at Facebook. And to make a very long story short, they decided to go a different direction in terms of who was going to be doing elections related stuff. And I was trying to figure out what was next for me. I moved back into public policy, and this is when I realized all the elections happening this year in 2024. I had met with a mentor in DC, and after we had chatted, I sat down and I was just trying to think about, what it was I might do. What are some of the problems? I was trying to look ahead. How can I look around corners? And I was like, okay, I know there was a lot of elections in 2014. There were in 2019. This seems to happen every 5 years. So sure enough, I started sketching out what all the elections in 24. And I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, there's the India, Indonesia, European Union ones, because those are on 5-year cycles. But Mexico's on a 6-year cycle. Wait, they were last in 2018. They're going to be in 2024 as well. Holy smokes, there's also US presidential. And so I actually remember rushing home and doing an Excel spreadsheet to see, I'm like, I think this is the first time this has ever happened. And sure enough, it was. And so I spent a lot of time, we were trying to think through of like, maybe I can help us prep for that, thinking about regulation. And then COVID hits and the world turns upside down. And it's all hands on deck to help wherever I can, help on elections, help to rethink the politics and government stuff, because that's now kind of a liability versus a strength for the company. But I could tell that, I had already been thinking about leaving the company after the 2020 election. It was 10 years of me being at the company. It was after the 2020 election. I was turning 40. And so I also spent a lot of that time mapping out my post Facebook journey. And that really looked like it was not an overnight thing at all. There was a long grieving process of really, my identity was so tied up in being a part of Facebook that it really, I remember first kind of thinking about it in summer of 2018. And a lot of my friends who had left the company reminded me that it was a journey, that it was going to be a long journey for how long I was there. And so I started thinking about, okay, what are the things that I like to do? Because when I was taking off the election stuff, one of the folks I know at the company were like, maybe you should just go another policy area, maybe go to privacy, maybe go, something else. And I was like, what? No, like elections are my jam. But I actually thought about it for a bit and I confirmed elections are my jam. Civic democracy, all this stuff are my jam. And I was like, okay, I know I want to keep doing that. I want to keep working on both US and international. And then I was like, okay, what things, these kind of exercises, what drain you, what give you excitement? I knew that I really liked managing people. I liked I had my team. I love them so much. I still do. I loved helping people to play to their strengths, to help remove roadblocks for them, help them to just do really great work. And I also enjoyed mentoring. I love teaching. I would guest teach at classes for friends, talking to students who are trying to get into this space and thinking about it. So I knew mentorship was going to be one of my pillars. I then also knew, I did a lot of public speaking on behalf of Facebook. I had done it before that. And I knew that I continued to want to have a voice in this space. And a little bit, I'll talk a little bit more about telling my story and why I did that. But I knew that, at the time, the only people really speaking out about these issues were either really big tech haters or they worked inside the company. And so I thought there needed to be more nuanced views, particularly from the center right out there. And so I thought I could potentially play a role in that. And so voice was my second pillar. My third pillar ended up being build, because I didn't want to just be somebody who talked about what should be done. I also wanted to help build it. Now, where this would live was a difficult question as well, because it was like I could go out on my own. That's scary. I don't know. It could be a think tank. It could be an academic institution, maybe another company. But I realized really quickly I was not in the mental state to go full time into somewhere. I was not in a state. I had too much stuff I wanted to do, and I needed some freedom in which to do it. And so I really started mapping out what going out on my own would look like. Talked to a lot of people to get a ton of advice, really great advice about how this should look. And if you're interested, I wrote a piece just recently, a little bit about some lessons learned from this. I've written about my journey and everything, which I'll link to in the show notes. So if you want to go into this more in depth there, you totally can. I also had a lot of support. I had a coach. Her name's Lori Brewer Collins. She has an amazing Substack that I will link to as well, where she brought together a group of us women. We started calling ourselves the Kick-Ass Women's Group, but we were all women in sort of our late 30s, early 40s, going through career transitions and trying to figure out what it was that we wanted to do next in our careers and what that would look like. And it was really great to have this group of women to not only have to be a stabling force during COVID, but also to not feel alone of what was happening in our own careers and how we were thinking about that. So I decided in March of 21, after 10 years, to leave Facebook and start Anchor Change. I then started putting together what I now realize was a portfolio life. And I became a fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center on their elections and democracy team. I eventually helped some of my former colleagues from Facebook called me up about wanting to start a nonprofit called the Integrity Institute. And so I was helping Sahar and Jeff and all of them get that institute off the ground. I started the newsletter in the fall of 21, which I'll go into again a little bit later here in the podcast. But I didn't know at the time this was going to be 2 weeks before all the Facebook files started dropping in the Wall Street Journal and Frances Haugen and all of that was happening. So there was a lot of interest in understanding sort sort of how a lot of this stuff played out within Facebook and things of that nature. I also then got connected to JUCO. I got connected to JUCO through the Atlantic Council, where I was a non-resident fellow. You'll notice I started wearing a lot of hats. It was really hard to kind of define where I was. And that's how I started doing all my corporate consulting, was through JUCO, being able to help their clients working on elections, policy development, things of that nature. I also went to go work at the International Republican Institute, running their tech and democracy team for a year, as well as then being a senior advisor. 2022 was quite a busy year because I also am on the board of the National Conference on Citizenship, and our board, or our CEO, had resigned, and so I had volunteered to become interim CEO while we tried to find a new one. So I actually ended up doing that for a year as well. Again, 2022, very busy. And then 2023, the layoffs start to hit. There's a lot more people out in this space. There's not as much funding now for the tech companies, and AI starts to explode. And so I was still not looking to go full time into anywhere. And but I was also knowing that I was going to have to start getting even more creative about how I diversified my income, because I launched paid subscriptions on the newsletter. I was getting, from these various different projects. And then Sydney with JUCO ended up calling in late November, right before Thanksgiving, wondering if I'd be willing to join JUCO as I got to pick the title as Global Affairs Officer, but she just wanted to know if I was willing to join. And I saw it as a real opportunity to, if I was going to have the most impact in this big year of elections, to actually be working directly with the companies. I also saw this as an opportunity to just turbocharge what I was already doing with this work. And they agreed to let me keep doing this podcast, to do the newsletter, and all of those things. And so I have joined them full time as of January, where I am really getting an interesting look at a cross section of the tech industry and what they are working on, the problems they are trying to solve. I'm spending a lot of time both in DC and San Francisco as part of doing that. But I'll dive into a bit more stuff here in a little bit here in the podcast. But that's kind of the story of how I got from Green Bay, Wisconsin to where I am today. Okay, before we go a bit more into the work stuff and everything, I also thought I should share a bit more about who I am outside of work. And so I shared a little bit of that in the intro, a bit about being from Green Bay. So I am a huge Green Bay Packers fan, also a Milwaukee Brewers fan, in addition to the Washington Nationals. But yeah, my sports of choice are mainly football and baseball, though I enjoy good March Madness when that comes around, and many other sports. I grew up playing softball and volleyball. I also curled. So whenever there's a Winter Olympics and people need to understand the game of curling, I am your gal. I actually won with my sister and a few other folks. We won bronze medal at the Junior State Olympic Games in Wisconsin. Though it definitely needs an asterisk, because it was so cold on the day of the final game that the other team couldn't get there. And so there was a bit of a forfeiting situation that happened. So if I'm 100% honest, it definitely has an asterisk to it, but it is kind of fun to tell people that I know how to curl and everything else like that. I really love to read. I really love to spend time outdoors. My parents have a cabin in northern Wisconsin that I go to every summer, where we go fishing. My family is very competitive. We play competitive solitaire. That is how competitive my family is. And for those of you who are not familiar with this particular game, you all get your own deck, but you get to play on each other's aces when you're all playing. And so it can get quite dangerous when we get, even if it's just two people. Regardless, we also have fishing competitions on that. I grew up hunting with my dad. I am a hunter. I've gone whitetail hunting, turkey hunting, a lot of bird hunting. I've also done some big game hunting with my dad over the years, where we've gotten caribou and moose and antelope and mule deer. My brother hunts as well. My sister does not, but she does fish. we actually do a whole family fishing trip up in Canada every other year now, where we take a float plane into a lake called Smooth Rock Lake, and we go walleye and northern pike fishing. We're going to be doing that again this summer here in June, which I'm really excited about. And so, yeah, when I'm up there at the cabin, it's a lot of kayaking, bike riding, all of that kind of fun stuff. Here, well, I'm not here right now. I'm in San Francisco, but in Washington, I've now been spending a lot more time on the Eastern Shore. As many of you who read the newsletter know that there's a lot of really fun places that we like to hang out, like the Jetty and the Kentmore. But it's really just a chill place, really for me to have a change of scenery, especially since I live at home. I'm single. I used to have a cat. I really want a dog, but with all the travel and stuff that I do, that's kind of hard right now. I really love to travel. I did so much of it with Facebook. I was on the road 250 days a year. And so I don't travel that much anymore, but I do really like going to different places. And I am so lucky to have such a network of former Facebook colleagues and others that I've met throughout the years in all of these different places that make traveling a ton of fun. And so I've also started to get, if you're reading some of my stuff as well, I'm getting a little bit more into things like tarot and astrology. For me, it's not about seeing the future or anything like that. It's just been really helpful of like giving frameworks and stuff for thinking through different problems and stuff like that. Some people use affirmation cards, others use different things, but that's something that I've found really helpful as I'm continuing to think through and go through my 40s. There's another piece too as well that I want to mention as part of this before we'll go into the next section. And I'll link to it in the show notes, but I did write a piece back in the fall of 2022 about reclaiming the fairy tale. I was, and I continue to be very frustrated at society that, for women, typically you only get celebrated if you are getting married, if you're having a child. And those are amazing things. And those are milestones that should be celebrated, but they aren't the only ones that should be celebrated. And, as a single woman, I bought my own house. I'm building my own business. Those things should be celebrated as well. And I ended up doing my own photo shoot to get more, not just headshots, but I did some fun, like very power poses and stuff like that as part of that. That was amazing. And I just want to write about it and talk about that a bit more, about how we should be thinking about celebrating all different types of women and their accomplishments in the workplace. And so that's been a big thing for me as well, is trying to work with more women and celebrate more women and finding more way that we can be coming together and doing a lot more of this work. So that's been a really fun thing to be thinking about and working through as part of all of this. Another thing I kind of want to mention as part of this to close this off is, a lot of people talk about work-life balance. And I find the other day I was working on this, and my manager ahead of the retreat was sort of like, stack rank these things. And, work-life balance is always one of those things on there. And I found myself really angry at that. And I'm like, I'm so tired of this either or. It's work and life. Like, for me, it is much more integrated. And for me, I'm trying to think much more about balance around, where am I learning versus teaching? Where am I being resting versus productive? Things of that nature. I wrote about this on Wednesday, right the day before this podcast is coming out. So now I'm holding myself accountable because I'm actually recording this before I write this, and I'm going to do that. But those are some of the things that I really think about. And that's another place where some of the tarot cards and some of these cards have really helped to illuminate some of that stuff. But yeah, I like a really different cross section of a lot of different things. When I'm not at work, though, in all honesty, I'm kind of always thinking about a lot of these things. Okay, let's go into a bit about what I actually do for my career and sort of what a typical day looks like. So my job at Duco as the Global Affairs Officer, I'm in charge of all of our business development, our comms and marketing, and I'm also a subject matter expert for some of our clients. So Duco is structured in that we have about 20-ish full-time employees who are real project managers for a lot of the work that we do for our clients. And then we have thousands of experts across about 70 different countries that have experience. Some of them are former tech workers, some are former government, some are academia, some have geographical expertise, some are issue-based expertise. Many people have multiple expertise that we work with. And so a client will hire us to do, something. They might want to understand how other tech companies are handling election policies, or they might want help writing a policy around hate and harassment or something like that. They might want help red teaming or stress testing some of their products or their tools. We really customize our work depending on what the clients need, and then we pull in the right experts in which to help them to do that. I've been sort of thinking about this and playing around with kind of calling it's like a fractional trust and safety team. So some of you may have heard the phrases of fractional CEOs or CMOs or CFOs, and these are executives who are not full-time at a place, but they do more than just consulting because they're really rolling up their sleeves and diving into the business of that company. And that is a lot of what we do, because there's other expert networks out there that will do things where, it's an hour-long phone call or something like that. And we are really much more project-based. And so I'm actually, talking to a lot of the people that I used to work with, meeting people at companies, trying to understand the problems that they have, and then helping to put together proposals of how we might help them, pricing that out, and then handing that off to our client account teams, our tech associates, who then really work on project managing those projects from start to finish. And then where it has to do with elections, I oftentimes get pulled in, not only elections, anything kind of trust and safety and other things. I might get pulled in to help scope things out or to help think about, what it is that we might want to do or how we want to approach that problem for that particular client. Now, my typical day, there is kind of one, there isn't one. I'm trying to figure out the routine. It's kind of different if I'm on the East Coast or the West Coast. Because when I'm on the East Coast, I try to, in the morning, spend a lot of that morning before the people on the West Coast wake up, reading through my newsletters, getting through my email, checking in on the news of the day. It's oftentimes when I'm most, when I can write, and when those types I have more energy then in which to do that type of work. And then in the afternoon, once especially the Duco folks are in the office, usually a lot of meetings in the afternoon, internal meetings, client meetings. And then my evenings are usually spent either, getting drinks or meeting people in DC, going to events, or also sometimes it's late work days because I'll be working there in DC till about 8:00 at night Eastern, which is 5:00 here Pacific. So it really kind of depends, but it's usually quite a bit of mixture of sort of staying on top of the news, understanding what's happening in the industry, talking to people, but then also some deep think work, and also writing time. Very much trying to find the right balance between all of that. I do on the weekends tend to go to the Eastern Shore versus staying in DC. There's also a lot of travel because when I'm here on the West Coast, I don't have that morning time necessarily. The one thing I don't like about the West Coast is I feel like I wake up behind the world all the time because there's so much stuff to get through. And so I end up actually catching up on the news and stuff usually at the end of the day than I do at the beginning of the day. But it all kind of depends upon where I am in the world and what I'm working on. Another question I get a lot from people are those who are wanting to get into a career in tech, or maybe they want to pivot and get into trust and safety. Regardless of what it is, there's no doubt that right now is a really tough time in which to get into this industry. It is going through a ton of different changes. You had all of the layoffs that happened over the course of the end of 2022. Throughout 2023, they're continuing to happen. So that means you do have a lot of people that are out there looking for jobs. The needs have also changed with AI exploding on the scene in so many different organizations and companies pivoting the work that they are doing. And so if my recommendation to a lot of folks is sort of, first of all, understanding, do you want to go into a bigger company, or you better fit in sort of a mid or a smaller size company, or maybe a startup? Because it's the old adage of being a big fish in a small pond, or a small fish in a big pond, because at those startups and midsize, you have a lot of real opportunity to do a lot more and to have a lot more latitude about the job that you can have and the work that you can do. I definitely found that with the early days of Facebook than you could today, where it is a lot more established, it's much bigger, there's a lot more processes and people and everything, so you have a much more narrower lane in which to think about. I also encourage people when they're thinking about a career in tech to think about, do they want to, and there's different stages in everybody's career, but some people I saw came into Facebook and they had a career that I called was more of a mile wide and an inch deep. So they tried to get experience on a ton of different teams, a ton of different product areas, problem areas, policy issues, etc. And so they knew a little bit about everything. Whereas I chose to go a little bit more of an inch deep and a mile wide, where I was very narrowly focused on elections and democracy and civic type issues vis-a-vis tech. And so I knew a lot about that, and a little bit about everything else. Now I'm kind of going back into probably a little bit more broader, because I'm getting to see a lot of different companies and a lot of different problems, and more of that, now more mile wide and inch deep. But I think both are really important things to think about. Another thing to think about when you're thinking about wanting a job in tech is what kind of job it is that you want. It is very different if you're an engineer, and I frankly know a lot less about that space than I do about sort of the non-product areas. But, if you're an engineer, you probably are going to go into the tech industry immediately. There's internships, stuff like that. Whereas if you are wanting to do it more from a public policy perspective, there oftentimes people were being hired. There were definitely junior level people that we were hiring to do different policy issues. And I should note there's a lot of nuances in this too, in the types of jobs, because there's public policy, and those are the folks going and talking to lawmakers and their staff and policy folks working in that world. And then there's those who are actually writing the policies of a company, so your content or your product policies. And so those are two different jobs and two different skill sets. And a lot of the people that got hired, especially for those public policy jobs, actually had long stints in Congress, in government, and other places before they actually came to that company, or they came from another company, but they had that work definitely prior. For a content or product policy role, a lot of those folks now have expertise in some of those areas, have been studying them in academia or think tank land and other places. And so if a job actually in tech is not, if that's kind of hard, especially given the job market, there's also, sort of tech adjacent jobs that I talk about to a lot of people. And so this can take a look. There's a lot of trust and safety vendors that are starting to pop up, different companies, software companies trying to help provide solutions to different companies that are options in which to go to. But then there are a lot of think tanks, nonprofits, academic institutions that are also worth looking at, that do work a lot in these issues. They work a lot with tech companies and can oftentimes lead to roles within, those types of organizations. And so I think the main thing is, again, just really thinking about the different types of experiences and skill sets that you can build up that might make you attractive to a company, because of sort of the types of people that and the experiences you have from those types of organizations that you can bring into one in tech. So I mentioned earlier, I love to read. I absolutely love to read. I love to read books. I love to read news. I like getting the hard copy newspaper if I can. I love to read, and I subscribe to a lot of newsletters. I follow, Twitter before Elon, but, still look at that a bit, but also Threads, Instagram, social media, sort of, I'm consuming from start to finish throughout any given day. I love listening to podcasts. And so there is a lot that is coming in through my inbox and other places. I hope to find, ways to help AI be able to help to summarize some of that stuff a little bit more, but I do dedicate quite a bit of time in my mornings. I use Superhuman for my email, which is really great because I have a dedicated newsletter tab. So that way I have, I can keep it in a dedicated spot for when I have time to go and read it. And so, usually in the morning and then multiple times through the day, I'm going through that. If there's something I want to read but don't have time, I like to set myself a reminder for it to come back in my inbox later that evening or maybe on the weekend when I know that I'm going to have time in which to read it, because I definitely don't have time to read everything. Sometimes I skim it. I'm also always looking for stuff to go in my Sunday newsletter of links that I think people would find interesting. So I keep a running Google Doc as well of things there. And so then when I'm putting together that newsletter on a Friday or a Saturday, when I tend to have a bit more time, I can open up those links and go in and read those. The types of things that I like to read really do span a lot of different topics. Politics, of course, tech, of course. I try to look for global sources of news and information. I also like gardening. I didn't mention that in the things I love to do, but I don't have a garden. Well, I kind of do now in the Eastern Shore. We did peppers and some tomatoes last year, and I hope to do the same this year. But Sunday I'm going to have a garden. So there's a couple of gardening Substacks that I like to follow. I like looking at fashion. I am not fashionable at all myself, but I like looking at it. And so there's some fashion blogs and stuff that I read as well. There's also some really great writers like Emily McDowell and others who on writing and just sort of life in general that I also really like to read and listen to. And so usually in the morning when I'm getting ready, I'm trying to listen to bits and pieces of a podcast, listen to a lot of podcasts when I'm driving to and from the shore, anytime I'm in the car, preparing dinner. I forgot to mention like to cook too. I mean, man, I missed all sorts of things in the things I like to do outside of my work. So I oftentimes listen to podcasts during all of that as well. And so some of the things I like to read in the morning definitely include a lot of your DC Inside the Beltway newsletters. I really like Mike Allen and all the folks at Axios. I love to read all of their newsletters. Politico Playbook, the Punch Bowl folks for understanding what is happening in Congress. I really like listening to Pivot with Kara Swisher and Scott Galloway in the morning. I also like to listen to On with Kara Swisher. I also like listening to the Ruthless Guys. These are gentlemen who still work for Mitch McConnell, but used to work in his Senate office, now do a lot for him on his PAC and things of that nature. I really like listening to them to get a sense of sort of what's happening in the Republican world around different things. I also like listening to, Smartlist is a really popular podcast. I really like listening to Politico Tech Policy Press, Everything in Moderation, Hard Fork, a lot of different ones. Rebecca Allman, who's the woman, my shaman that I work with on tarot and a lot of that stuff. She has a beautiful podcast called Voices in the River. Lori Brewer Collins, who I mentioned earlier, does a fantastic podcast on leadership in talking to different people. And so those are a lot of, some of the podcasts and stuff that I listen to. In newsletters, I also very much read Politico's Mark Scott and Digital Bridge comes out every Thursday. Disinfo Docket is fantastic. There is some Latin America briefing that has a lot of stuff for Latin America. I really like listening to reading Everything in Moderation, Tech Dirt, which includes Mike Masnick and all of his wonderful folks. The Integrity Institute podcast is another great one. There's a whole bunch of them that I'm going to pull some of them in for the show notes, and I plan on doing a bigger newsletter around them with some of my must reads on that, and also, some of my book recommendations and things of that nature. But I'm usually not reading a ton. I do get I turned off all the red dots on my phone last year, and it was the best decision I ever made. Other than for text messaging and WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger and Signal, I don't get any red dots on my phone. So I have to consciously go in and choose when I want to read stuff, because otherwise I was having so much anxiety trying to go in and clear out those red dots. And I also put a ton of things in the schedule notifications because I found myself getting so distracted throughout the day. And so, throughout the afternoon and stuff, I'm usually only doing a quick glance at sort of what might be coming in. And then I usually do another round in the evening, because that's when Casey Newton's newsletter comes out and some others. I really like Puck News. And so I tend to do another round of reading in the evening with my newsletters and everything. Throughout the day, checking social media here and there, though I try to also limit that. And then I am usually reading. My reading usually happens much more in the evening or when I'm traveling, especially on vacation. I have once in a while try to do those reading vacations like Bill Gates does. I've only done them for like more reading weekend than I have an actual reading vacation, but I do a lot of books around tech and politics. I'm reading one right now called The Fourth Turning is Here, which is looking at sort of some of the historical cycles that society has gone through in the past and how we are now in a fourth turning one again right now in society. And it's helpful, I think, to look back at history and how we've gone through difficult times before and how we've sort of gotten out from them. But I don't have any sort of magical schedule or anything that I do. I've just found the things that work really well for me. And sometimes I'm skimming to see what's interesting. I also, some days, when you're just so tired and there's just been so much going on. I have definitely also pulled the just like gone bankrupt thing where I just delete everything in my newsletter tab. I do a quick skim just to make sure I didn't miss anything important, but then I'm like, I just can't do it today. And that has been perfectly fine to do every once in a while as well, because there is a lot of stuff coming at us. But one of the things I do try to do with my newsletter, especially on Sundays, is if you don't have that sort of time to kind of be constantly consuming a lot of these different outlets and everything like that, is kind of giving you a brief rundown of some of the stuff that I have found most interesting. And so if you don't already subscribe to the newsletter, acrechange.substack.com, go there. And those are newsletters that I do on Sundays. I want to get into a little bit more about writing my Substack, doing this podcast, why I do so many speaking appearances, talking to reporters, all of that kind of stuff, because it's something I get asked by a lot of folks, especially ones that maybe didn't do a lot of that when they were inside of a company and feel like they have a lot that they want to say or share with the world, and they're not quite sure if they want to do that or not. And first and foremost, I need to say that, like, one, you do not need anyone's permission to tell your story. You have every right to tell your story, your experiences, your thoughts, your viewpoints. You do not need to wait for permission from anyone. Now, a lot of you have NDAs and things of that nature. You definitely need to follow those, and there are certainly ways to think about that smartly, and ways to do that you will not be violating NDAs. So I'm not encouraging you to break the law, but you still have your own story, and there are ways of thinking about doing that and doing that smartly. You can always talk to an employment lawyer, an NDA lawyer, to better understand the rules around that. But, there are a lot of things that you can do in terms of up-leveling, looking at the industry as a whole that you may have worked at. But, one of the things I knew I wanted to tell my story because I didn't want anybody else to tell it. And the things that I had worked on at Facebook were so much in the news, especially after the Facebook files and Frances Haugen, that I wanted to make sure that this is a choice of mine. I wanted to be telling my story. I want to be telling my perspective, and I didn't want anybody else to do that. Others chose differently, and that is totally fine. This is a personal choice to every single person. How this manifests is also very different. I started the newsletter mainly for me. I knew that I wanted to have an outlet to help me to think through these various problems, to think through how I thought about them, where I was seeing the trends going. And if others found it helpful, that was great. But the newsletter was first and foremost for me. And I had to tell you, even too, despite the fact I was a journalism major in school, when I left Facebook, I had so much insecurity around my writing. There was always just this constant voice in the back of my head being like, you're a bad writer, you're a bad writer. I was also nervous about, like, am I doing this right? Am I going to get in trouble with Facebook or others around this, how this might work? And so working with a writing coach really helped me. And not jumping into it right away. Like, I really took, 6 months or so to really think about how I wanted to do this and what it was going to look like. And it does sort of constantly evolve. I also thought through my values of what I was going to talk about, what I wasn't going to talk about. I didn't want to get into the nitty gritty of who was in the room and made this decision or did this thing. I didn't want to be pigeonholed as just the Facebook person and only be talked to about Facebook type of roles. I really wanted to up level a lot of these issues because it was something the entire industry was talking about. I also too, especially as layoffs were happening and other things, I wanted to give more of, humanize these trust and safety teams, talk a bit more about the type of work that they were doing. Because, when you're on the inside of this company and all you're hearing externally is you're not doing enough, you're not doing enough, you're not doing enough, and you know that, and you know that you're trying to do as much as you can. There's also a difference between those being on the front line versus what the executives are deciding. And so I wanted to up level that as much as possible. And so for me, that took the form of writing a newsletter, being someone on social media, talking to the press, doing speaking engagements. I just really enjoy that. I know other people much more prefer they do LinkedIn. They do a lot of LinkedIn posts. The Integrity Institute has been a great resource for many people on trust and safety. You know, the elections best practices deck that we did is something that we had a lot of different members feed into. They've also done them on transparency and other things. And there's been ways for people to share their expertise. Same thing with Tech Policy Press, with Lawfare, with a lot of those types of publications have been ways for people to write a single op-ed if maybe they don't want to be dedicating to doing a regular newsletter or something like that. But for everybody, it is sort of your own choice, and you have a lot of different options that you can go and experiment with. For me, you know, at first when I started writing the newsletter, I was like, it's going to be once a week. I was cramming into one newsletter the analysis, the calendar, and the links. It was getting quite long. And I actually ended up working with a Substack coach last year, Sarah Fay, who was fantastic and was like, actually, people don't have that much time. They'd prefer shorter newsletters. You're better off breaking these up into each their own newsletter. And so that's what I did. She also encouraged me to be very consistent on the days and the times that I publish, because people like that consistency. Because I had kind of jumped around whenever I was feeling it. I would write something. But I do really love the discipline now of having, you know, I know that Sundays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays at 9 a.m. are going to be those pieces, 9 a.m. Eastern, and then Thursdays at 6 a.m. are going to be this podcast that I do. And so I really like that discipline of doing all of that. Now, in terms of, I mentioned in the previous segment, the links that I do, a lot of it's as I'm doing my reading throughout the week. I'm collecting those links and then just formatting them on a Friday or Saturday and getting them ready to go on a Sunday. For my analysis pieces, it's a little bit different. So a lot of it is very much what is kind of on top of mind for me that week. Sometimes that is something in the news around tech. Sometimes that is something more about career advice. Sometimes it's just life advice. But I usually start thinking, try to think a couple of weeks ahead sometimes. I definitely try to look at when there's going to be something newsworthy, like recently with the Supreme Court arguments around Murphy v. Missouri. When I know those types of milestones are coming up, or like Facebook's 20th birthday, I have those in the back of my mind as something I might want to write about then. But otherwise, it is sort of very much, I start, as soon as I finish one, I'm starting to think about the next. I usually have a couple of ideas kind of constantly ruminating if there's not something of top of mind that week. You know, the one that I wrote yesterday around, you know, an essay kind of on balance and how I think about balance, really is something that came out of the conversation I had with my manager, where they were asking me to kind of stack rank how important work-life balance was. And I can't get it out of my brain. And so I'm like, okay, I got to write at this, because this is clearly something that I'd like to write about. I'd like to think through more. And so I'm going to do that through the newsletter. I also have another idea I really want to write about I mentioned earlier, the fractional trust and safety leader or team, and how can we think about that, about what companies might need, and how can we start to help people get trust and safety built in sooner without necessarily needing as many resources and stuff like that. So it really is sort of, you know, kind of a rumination, kind of constantly thinking about it. I use Google Docs for all this. And so I'm usually writing down notes of different ideas. Sometimes I'm emailing them to myself. I'm sure, like many of you, ideas come at the craziest of times. So always just kind of trying to jot down. Talking to people really helps a lot too in my meetings and stuff like that, to see what ideas are resonating or things that I might want to do. And then I usually sit down. It depends. Sometimes it's in the morning. Most times it's the morning. It's either in the morning or after dinner, I find to be my most productive times for writing something. And I'll sit down and do the first draft. And then I usually do a round of editing using Grammarly. But I usually only read through it once or twice, unless it's something that I'm like particularly nervous about because it's about a hot button issue, something I know that could be something that I might get attacked for. Those I might, you know, sit and read a few more times and do a bit more editing, but I usually try to, Facebook way, this phrase, done is better than perfect. And I definitely try to have that mantra with the newsletter, and just try to get it out the door. I know, you know, some are better than others, but it's just, for me, that's been the process that has worked the best. I look at the stats. but I mainly, really like to look at who is signing up for the newsletter, paying attention to the comments. But again, because this newsletter is really, first and foremost was selfishly for me, I'm trying not to be obsessed with the number of subscribers I have. I appreciate every single one of you. But, for me, it's much more about just getting interesting ideas out there into the world than necessarily, and having really quality subscribers versus necessarily the quantity of subscribers. So I will not be sad as that subscriber list continues to grow. And so we'll see, I'm continually thinking about experimenting whether I want to do like more video. I've been putting the podcasts up on YouTube a lot more. Do I want to do audio versions of the newsletter? Right now I'm producing almost all of this by my own. I have somebody great who edits the podcast. But otherwise it's just me producing, creating, doing all of it. So there's only so many hours in the day. But I do continue to think about how I might be able to experiment and continue to think about how I evolve this Substack and the different types of things that I might want to be working on. All right, last thing. I did not mention this in my who I am outside of work and stuff like that. But those of you who know me know that I'm a huge West Wing fan. And as I was putting together this episode, I'm like, I have to end with President Bartlett's famous phrase, "What's next?" I am loving my work at Duco. I'm definitely trying to figure out the right balance between that work, my writing, content creation. I have so much different stuff I want to do. I'm having a ton of fun trying to think about how to diversify my income streams. A lot of you know I've been playing, I've got the Panic Responsibly merch site, which is something that I think would be fun to continue to think about growing. Someday might want to think about doing, do I do retreats or events, or how does all of that look? Because I really admire how folks, whether it's like Axios or Semaphore or Kara Swisher and Casey Newton and others, are really building up their own sort of, they're diversifying their media empires and how they're trying to amplify these voices. And so for me, if you've talked to me before, you know that I tell a lot of people, I think the world's going to look so different in 2025. It's really hard to plan about what might be next. I am working on my book, looking at the last 20 years of how tech has impacted elections and weaving my own story that you heard earlier. There are very bits and pieces of it, weaving that throughout that book. And so that's something that I'm hoping to be able to have come out in late 2025 or early 2026 to be something that is focused on. And the other thing too is that elections, we're going to keep having elections in this globe. I am not, again, with the Panic Responsibly line, I am not a doomsayer that think that this is going to be the end of elections or democracy by any stretch of the imagination. And AI is just introducing a ton of very fascinating problem sets as part of all of this. And so I am really excited for this next chapter and what it might bring, even though I have no idea what it's going to hold or what that's going to look like. I really appreciate you all listening through to this podcast. Let me know if you liked it. It was my first time doing something solo. It's kind of weird to be talking for this long, but if there are pieces of it that you liked, if there's additional things you want me to go through, if you never want me to do it again, please let me know. I love all of the feedback and I really appreciate it. And I just want to say a huge heartfelt thank you to every single one of you, newsletter subscribers, podcast listeners, people who've come up to me and just told me how much you enjoy this content. It means a ton to me. I cannot tell you when I am deciding whether or not on a Saturday to record something like this or go hang out in the park. It really gives me the motivation in which to do so. So thank you again, and thank you for listening.